All right, so we're back again to lean into what does it look like to trust God in the midst of chaos, right? Where is Jesus in the midst of it? We're still in Genesis.
Sure.
So what did we make it through last week? 13?
We got through a little further into the Abraham narrative. So we covered like Genesis 12 through 22.
Okay.
That's the main section of Abraham.
And now we're just going to sort of plow through Genesis.
Yeah, and it's intentional because I think when we're thinking about we're following Jesus, where is Jesus in this? Genesis is one of those very foundational texts into just understanding, the Jewish worldview and everything that God is up to in the world. So we're not going to do this with every sort of book.
We're not going to go through every book. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're going to be in Leviticus forever.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But it's sort of like maybe like if you think even about a house and the way a house is constructed, like you don't see the foundation.
Totally.
But it's really important.
Oh.
So you see the walls, you see the windows, you think, oh, I want to remodel, I want to make it cuter, whatever.
Yeah.
But actually the foundation is incredibly important to the rest of the house. And Genesis functions like that for the Bible.
100%. Yeah. Genesis and even the Exodus story we'll get into in a couple weeks here. Those two are kind of like the bedrock, if you will, for what constantly just keeps repeating throughout the Old Testament. The themes that you see in Genesis and Exodus just kind of go on repeat.
Yeah. So just like you don't want to rush through doing a foundation, like this corner is good.
Yeah.
Right. But then the house tips.
Sure.
Like
exactly.
this actually provides a baseline for how we understand Jesus.
Exactly.
And how we understand trust as we look at it in the New Testament.
Exactly. 100%. Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of the big reason why we're kind of taking this approach through that.
Yeah.
And then as we are looking at the text itself, we've talked about Abraham, a few of the stories there kind of on last week's sort of discussion time. I want to just kind of quickly sort of highlight just continuing on with Abraham and into some of the generations that follow. And then maybe we can just kind of have a deeper conversation in particular on the Joseph narratives that come at the end of the book of Genesis.
Yeah, sounds good.
So that's kind of the lay of the land, so to speak. But, kind of looking at the notes here. And again, if I encourage you guys, if you're listening to this, the notes, we've emailed those out, kind of grab those. But kind of just a quick overview here of Genesis 12 through 50, which is basically the big second half section of the book of Genesis. Again, it covers mostly Abraham's life, but then also the generations that follow. Yeah. Kind of the key things that keep coming up is God is faithful, God is faithful, God is faithful. Abraham has his ups and downs. Yeah. But then what's interesting is a lot of these cycles of Abraham's faithfulness and unfaithfulness that gets repeated in his son Isaac and then in his son Jacob as well. And so I have this small little section on 6.1.2 in the notes called the Comedy of Errors. Okay. That's not original language to me, but the point is that no matter how many times God shows himself to be faithful or reiterates his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those are the three successive generations in Genesis, it always seems like the characters in Genesis are like trying to find a way to mess things up, right? But they just do kind of human stuff, if you will, right? So Abraham gives his wife away not once, but twice. Yeah. There's all this conflict between Abraham and Lot. We've talked about that. Yeah. There's the Hagar incident on multiple occasions in Genesis 16 and then also in Genesis 21. Yeah. Isaac gives his wife away, Rebecca, just like his father did.
Like his dad.
Yeah. So it's like the family pattern sort of thing. There's a bunch we could talk about with that. Jacob, he steals a blessing. And there's this kind of weird story with Jacob and Esau. Yeah. Jacob's name means deceiver. Wow. And so in Jacob also, this is a fun fact. Jacob, when he's born, he's grabbing the heel of his brother. And you think about earlier in the book of Genesis, who is the first, quote, heel grabber? Well, it's the snake, right? The snake is biting the heel of the snake crusher. And so there's this interesting thing that's happening here. Not to say that Jacob's like Satan or anything like that, but it kind of foreshadows Jacob's deception and kind of Jacob's role in the story is he's not all that great of a guy in the story. Yet again, the major theme,
God is faithful.
God is faithful
throughout that process.
Exactly.
So as even the chaos, the comedy of errors is sort of going about, right? God is faithful through that process, even as people are deceiving, even as people are following in the sinful footsteps of their parents.
Exactly.
God is faithful.
God is faithful through this whole entire process. So this becomes just this huge anchoring point. And so, I would just encourage people, if you can, read a lot of these narratives and just see like there's the honesty of these narratives.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of these Old Testament stories, we kind of prop these characters up as like heroes.
But when you dig in, it's like, man, these guys are a lot more like me or worse than me than I thought.
Yeah. And then you see God's just amazing faithfulness in this. And I think it's awe-inspiring and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So as the story progresses with the family of Abraham, you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Those are kind of the three main generations. But then the story really, kind of surprisingly, I would say, slows down on this character of Joseph. And so from Genesis 37 through basically the end of the book. So
I mean, that's a lot.
13 chapters. That's a lot of airtime, if you will, for basically one character and his family, one generation. And so I think anytime you kind of see that sort of slowing down in the biblical narrative, it means something. There's important things to sort of draw out there in the story. So that's kind of one of the things I wanted to do in this sort of time here, is just kind of work through. Obviously, can't say everything, but work through sort of the Joseph story. So
awesome.
Yeah. So you have the Joseph narrative again. It starts in Genesis 37, right? And so it begins with Joseph. He's also oftentimes, I've found, kind of depicted as like this, amazing, wise, just great character.
At the end of his life.
Yeah, at the end
of his... In the beginning, like, it would be hard to be his brother.
Exactly.
Let's be honest.
Totally. Yeah. If you read
he's kind of narcissistic. He's kind of like showing off. He's kind of like, oh, I had this dream.
Yeah, totally. He's a little like, you kind of wonder, like, are you just socially aware of kind of like your actions, Like if you've ever kind of been around people, you're like, you're not the most, fun to be around. Yeah,
it makes sense that you were not that well liked.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Maybe not thrown into a pit.
Exactly, I don't want to, validate the actions of his brothers, but because what we're referring to here is he has this kind of hot-headed, arrogant attitude because his father Jacob has favored him. Yeah. And has given him this sort of royal robe, this coat of many colors. This is kind of the children's Bibles all have it. And it's like this symbol of kind of favoritism, which I think there's an error on Jacob's part there that we could, flesh out a little bit. Sure. But kind of what it comes down to is there is this tremendous amount of jealousy on the part of Joseph's brothers that happened in the narrative. And so what happens is Joseph's brothers, they kind of have this interchange and they're kind of debating on what exactly should we do? Should we kill him? Should we, sell him, whatever? They end up selling him, and Joseph ends up going to Egypt. Yep. Now, I want to kind of zoom in here a little bit just to look at the coat or the garment of Joseph, because it kind of paints this sort of literary picture and kind of gives some, I guess, depth and meaning into what is happening in Joseph's life. And it kind of shows the pattern or the transformation that is going to happen in Joseph's life. Okay. Kind of following this theme of Joseph's coat or his garment. So we've mentioned that the Joseph story in Genesis 37 starts with this coat of many colors. Yeah. He's arrogant, all that sort of stuff. And that's the beginning of the Joseph narrative. But kind of on the notes here, on if you guys are following along with the notes, I have this diagram that kind of shows on 7.1 and following how Joseph's kind of garment or his coat has this beautiful pattern. Now, I want to pause real quick here because I want to mention two kind of quick facts about the Joseph narrative. Joseph, before I get into this coat thing, Joseph is the first character in the Bible where God shows what is often translated in our English Bibles, steadfast love. So it's this Hesed, exactly. It's the covenant love of God. That word. There you go. Yeah, totally. Yeah, we talk about it a lot.
Well, it's hard to translate into English.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, because that's one of the beautiful things about this word. It's like the English word love is a little bit limiting. So you have like steadfast love or faithfulness or everlasting kindness. All these different ways of trying to capture getting at this word because it's this beautiful, deep, rich word to express God's covenant, loyal love to his people. Yeah. And the first character where that love is described from God to another human by God himself through the text is in the Joseph narrative. And so Joseph's one who's going to go through this tremendous kind of trial, detour, wilderness sort of experience. Yeah. And it's in that moment Joseph is encountering the Hesed, the covenant love of God. Yeah. Joseph is also the first character in Scripture where the Spirit of God Joseph is said to have the Spirit of God. Where when we think about in the New Testament language, the Holy Spirit is empowering Joseph. And so it's in Joseph's sort of exile when he ends up in Egypt. The text says that Joseph is filled with the Spirit of God. And I think it's just, I say those things because it's the Joseph narrative is not all, especially if you're Joseph, all this kind of rosy, easygoing sort of life.
Hardly.
It's a terrible set of circumstances if you're Joseph. And it's this kind of, I think of it as like a detour or this major transition or this major sort of pivot that Joseph is kind of forced into, albeit because of his brothers. Yeah. And it's in that moment that he encounters God's presence over and over in the Joseph narrative. It says God was with him, God was with him, God was with him. Joseph experiences the Hesed, the covenant love of God over and over again. And then Joseph is filled with the Spirit of God as he is basically becomes like the vice president, if you will, of
pretty
Egypt.
Crazy.
Yeah. So
from
he
like
just
slave to essentially like the manager of the Egyptian estate.
Exactly. Totally. Yeah. So there's all those sorts of things are just kind of looming in the narrative as you read from Genesis 37:4. Now, back to where I was going.
Back to coats.
Back to the coats,
okay.
right? So now we're ready for the coats.
Coat. I'm back to my like image in my brain of the children's Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, back
to
the
coats. So there's actually a very I don't know what the word is. Maybe sophisticated might be too big of a word there, but there's this very
that's definitely not in the kids' Bible.
Not in the kids' Bible, but there is, work with me here. There's a very sophisticated thing happening with the coats or the garment. In Genesis 37, again, Joseph has there's this chart that shows the descension and then the ascension, if you will, of Joseph. In Genesis 37, Joseph has these two dreams as a ruler, and by his father, he's been given this coat of many colors. The language also can be a royal robe, tongue twister there. Okay. And so, but at that moment, Joseph is full of arrogance. He's kind of hot-headed.
Sure.
He's not who he's going to end up being by the end of the story. But then, as you kind of go through the story, the next time this idea of a garment or a coat appears is in Genesis 39. So just a few chapters later, Joseph has found himself in Egypt at this point. Yeah. Joseph is becoming semi-successful. He's working hard. Yeah. But there's this moment where he has this encounter with what's the character of Potiphar's wife.
Yeah. What's her name? Is there a name given?
That's a good question. I don't think she's actually named. It's just I've
Potiphar's
always heard
wife.
it Potiphar's wife.
Totally.
I don't know. Maybe someone, if you're listening to this, you can let us know. But it's interesting because in the story of Potiphar's wife, Joseph is kind of in this spot of temptation. Yeah. And there's this whole moment where Potiphar's wife says, "Come lay with me, come to bed with me," and Joseph turns and flees. Yeah. But then it says that Potiphar's wife took his garment. He had Joseph's garment still in his hands, and so it's actually
in Genesis 37, didn't they take his garment
exactly
when they threw him into a pit? Right?
Exactly.
So he's given the garment. His garment's taken. Now it's taken. Another garment time is taken by Potiphar's wife.
Totally. Yeah. So it's a good reminder because in the earlier, right? Yeah. The brothers, they take Joseph's garment, they dip it in blood, and they kind of deceive his father, Jacob, that like a lion or some beast has eaten him. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So both of these instances, Joseph is, he's not doing anything wrong, like especially in the Potiphar's wife scene. Yeah. This is a beautiful moment of fleeing, sexual temptation, that whole sort of example there. But what ends up happening is Joseph has essentially now been framed. Yeah. And he gets thrown into prison for a number of years.
Thrown in a pit. Now he's thrown into prison.
Yeah. And so
rough.
At least from Joseph's perspective, your life is spiraling down, right? Yeah. This is not a good spot to be. So in Genesis 39 and into chapter 40, Joseph finds himself in prison. He has a few instances where he's able to interpret a few dreams. Yeah. And he tells one of the people that is going to be released, "Hey, remember me? Yeah. Remember that what we had going on here." I think it's the baker. Yeah, exactly. And so, but Joseph ends up being forgotten. Yeah. And this becomes kind of like the low point for Joseph.
He's already had dreams at the beginning, right? Exactly. So he had dreams at the beginning that he like sort of shows off with. Now he has dreams again, or interprets someone else's dreams. They abandon him. He's in prison. He's at the low point.
Totally. Yeah. Because this is where Joseph, he has like this gift or this ability from God to be able to interpret dreams. He kind of arrogantly abuses that, if you will, in the beginning, where he's telling his brothers, "You guys are all going to bow down and worship me."
But he's actually right, isn't he?
He's right. He is right. But it's one of those things where you can be right in the wrong way. And it just comes off very off-putting.
Not very good. Yeah.
Totally. Oh yeah. 100%. So you have Joseph kind of back into the narrative here. Yeah. Genesis 39 and 40. He's in the pit. in prison.
Yeah.
You know, if you're at this moment in the story, this is the low point. Like,
Yep.
You know, it's
Totally.
easy for us in retrospect to see, okay, it's all going to turn out good, but just kind of immerse yourself in the narrative.
Yeah.
This is the low point for Joseph. But eventually, Genesis 41, Joseph gets lifted up out of prison. So it's even the imagery of being thrown into a pit kind of visually, at least in our heads, should help us think about that descent going lower and lower into like a literal pit, and also just kind of metaphorically as well. But Joseph is lifted from the pit. I think that's also, and if you want to get really geeky, it's a lot of the language from the Psalms. He has lifted me from the pit and set my feet upon a rock. All of these echoes are just blending together here.
Okay.
Joseph is able to now interpret some dreams for the Pharaoh, kind of predicting the pending famine or the pending season of bounty, and then the pending
7
famine.
years.
Yeah, the 7 years, and there's that exchange there. And in that moment, Joseph is given some new garments again. And it's kind of highlighting, okay, there's this shift that's been happening in Joseph where now he's not using his like ability is maybe kind of the wrong word. Yeah. But it's now he's serving other people.
Yeah. The gifts that God gave him at the beginning, he sort of used in a way that like created division.
Exactly.
Between him and his brothers. Now he's using those gifts to serve this nation.
Exactly. Yeah. In a moment of crisis, or at least in a moment at this point in the narrative of pending crisis. Yeah. But then later on, as the story progresses, Joseph then is finally officially elevated to that sort of vice president sort of role. And he's given a whole new set of garments again as kind of like a ceremony or this moment of recognition of here's Joseph, the Pharaoh says, you know, people are going to come to him. He's going to administer how to steward these resources in this moment of crisis. And here's Joseph now sort of kind of at the pinnacle, if you will, at least in sort of this part of the narrative of kind of this whole shift that's happened in his life.
That's
so
awesome.
It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see just kind of how tracing this small little
the dreams and the robes
has led to this moment of sort of transformation in Joseph. Now, what I want to kind of just focus in on a little bit here is that seeing the Joseph narrative can be sort of like a case study in sort of navigating detours in moments of like deep transition in our lives.
What do you mean?
So like, if you think about Joseph, right, he's you know, with his family, he's with Jacob, his father, his brothers. Yeah. His life, at least in his mind, is going a certain direction. Okay. Everything that happens that we have in Scripture, at least from the perspective of Joseph, is not on his radar.
Yeah. He's feeling like, I'm gonna rock this.
Yeah. I'm the favored son.
Yeah. Like I'm in an awesome spot.
I'm good to go. Yeah. And out of the blue, at least from his mind, he gets sold into slavery. Yeah. He gets, you know, basically framed for something he did not do. Yeah. He gets thrown into prison, and life just seems to be just falling apart. Yep. Just this huge moment of like a detour, a transition moment that has to happen. But what's beautiful about the Joseph story is it shows us the work that God often and can do in those moments of sudden change, of, at least from our perspective, surprise change, and the transformation that God, in the moments that God wants to meet us in those to bring about transformation. Wow. You know, I think the last thing Joseph probably expected was to ever end up in Egypt. Yeah. And the last thing he probably ended up expecting was to being kind of the head leader to save the world in a moment of global crisis. Totally. But God met him in that journey. Again, throughout the Joseph narrative, especially early on in Genesis 39, it talks about how the Lord was with Joseph. Mm-hmm. And I always find that striking and interesting because at the moment where God reiterates his presence with Joseph is in a moment of crisis. Mm-hmm. In the moment where God reminds Joseph, or the text reminds us of God's presence with Joseph, is in this moment, not where he's all comfortable, you know, with his father and he's the favored son, but in a moment where the story drastically shifts. Wow. And, you know, it's not like a perfectly clean, you know, parallel to necessarily our day. Like we're not being sold into slavery or anything like that. But our lives have had to pivot drastically in a short amount of time. And I think one of the main things we can learn about this is like the work that God wants to do in these pivot, detour, transition moments of Joseph didn't waste this time. Yeah. I think Joseph, not only was God present, I have a couple of important observations here, that God was present. We've talked about that. but Joseph was present too.
Yeah.
In this, Joseph isn't just we don't read about him moping around or just kind of wallowing in like this sort of self-pity of like, this is all happening to me and all that sort of stuff. The text talks about how Joseph was a skilled worker. He was responsible. He was gaining favor in the eyes of the Pharaoh. He was kind of gaining a reputation of being a hard worker, things like that, where he's
engaged.
He's engaged. Exactly. So not only is God present, Joseph is present and engaged as well in that. And I know that's easy for us to talk about.
Yeah.
It's, again, we're living in the middle of it. It's often very hard to do.
It's easier to sit on the couch and eat hot Cheetos and drink a beer and check out than it is to engage and be present to your spouse, your kids, to God and your work and all that, and like choose in. To actually choose to actually engage with God. What are you doing, or what do you want to do in this moment? I have this quote here. I won't read the whole thing here, but I think it kind of points out, it sums up what I'm saying here on 7.13, the second part where Joseph is present. It says, Joseph is present on his own detour. He's diligent in Potiphar's household. He applies himself, even though his heart is obviously aching for home. Yeah. You know, I resonate with that. Like there's this ache for what we had 4 months or 4 weeks ago kind of a thing, you know? And so it's not a denial.
Yeah.
It's not a pretending like, oh, it's all fine.
Exactly.
It's a sort of owning that, but also still a choosing in.
So there's still like a cognitive, I don't know if cognitive is the right word, but there's still a choice that we have to make that, you know, I'm not just going to let this consume me. Yeah. You know, he goes on to say, the author, this guy named by Jeff Mannion, says, I can imagine the temptation to cross his arms, Joseph's arms, as he is led through the gates of Potiphar's estate. I'm not your stinking slave. I'm the favored son of a wealthy, nomad in Canaan. I'm not going to do anything here. I don't belong here. But this is not what occurs in the narrative. Joseph serves Potiphar and works hard. And this is powerful because in our detours, we can be tempted to zone out, numb out, and check out. When we are somewhere we don't want to be, locked in, and getting to work is not always easy. Yeah. You know, I totally resonate with that. Yeah. And I think there's this beautiful invitation as we see the Joseph narrative. Okay, here is a moment in Joseph's life that's unexpected, chaotic, you know, and it's not his fault, so to speak. Yeah. I'm sure, the arrogance play a little bit into that. Sure. But he
didn't deserve to get thrown in a pit and sold into slavery because he was a little arrogant as a young boy. Yeah. Who wasn't as a young boy.
Exactly, right? I think the text even says he was 17. Yeah. Like he's a late teenager. I mean, you got to give him a break.
Yeah, he's got a lot of testosterone.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. And to just see, like what God does not only in his life, but through his life. Yeah. And how this moment that Joseph's facing was not wasted. Yeah. And it ends up bringing about the healing and saving of Joseph's family, of his brothers. And as the story progresses, and Egypt and the nation. So you have this beautiful figure. I mean, this is a beautiful sort of foreshadowing of the work of Jesus, where Jesus is, kind of on parallel with this Joseph narrative in so many ways, where he is kind of thrown into a pit, so to speak, but he comes out the other side to bring healing and saving for not only his own family, but for all of the world. Yeah. And that's exactly what Joseph is doing, at least the known world, in this story. And again, just to remember, Joseph's the first character to experience and to have experienced the steadfast love of God, the first character to be empowered by the Spirit of God, and he's constantly being empowered by God's presence. Yeah. And that might seem like a simple observation, but just to remember that is being described in the moment of brokenness and chaos in Joseph's life. And I wonder for us, like how much of the invitation of God is, I want you, church, to experience more of my Spirit, more of my presence, and to know, not just on a cognitive theological level, but to know my steadfast love in these moments. And I think there is a beautiful spot there for us to step into that, as his people. And, as the story goes on, you have the whole scene. Joseph's brothers come. Yeah. Joseph kind of hides his identity, at least in the first round.
He's trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, he's trying to figure out how have they been transformed? Yeah. Have the brothers learned a little bit?
Those are the ones who sold him into slavery.
Exactly. They're the ones that have done that. So I'm not going to get into all the details of that part of the story, but what I love by the end of the story is that there's this beautiful moment of I guess you can call it reconciliation of coming back together, where even after Jacob, the father, dies, the brothers are terrified that Joseph is going to now, get his moment of revenge now that Jacob's out of the picture, and they're all afraid. And Joseph has a beautiful moment in Genesis 45 where he says, do not fear, like you sold me into slavery, but that was for the saving of many lives. Yeah. And then the very famous line is Genesis 50 verse 20, basically at the end of the book of Genesis, where Joseph is interacting with his brothers, and he says, as for you, you meant evil against me, right? There's no ignoring it. There's no
that was your intent.
Brushing it aside. You meant evil against me. This is Genesis 50, verse 20, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive or to be saved as they are today. And I find this interesting, not only in relationship with the Joseph story, and I think we'll end here, but also as the end of the book of Genesis. Because what we see here is not only is this Genesis 50 verse 20 a summary of what has happened in the Joseph narrative, humans do
but the
evil,
whole book.
But the whole book, exactly. Good and evil. I mean, if there's ever a hyperlink or an allusion in the book of Genesis, good and evil is it. Go all the way back to Genesis 3, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what you see from Genesis 3 forward is humans redefining good and evil or choosing evil at the expense of trusting God and his good plan. And humans constantly are doing evil, or ra is the Hebrew word there, but God is constantly showing his goodness. And as for you, humans, we often mean evil. We often contribute to the chaos of this world, but God's the faithful one. God's going to bring about good.
He's going to bring about good, even though there is chaos, even though there is evil, even though there's repeating patterns in the life of Abraham and the life of Isaac. Right? Well, we see this repeat and this downward spiral. God is faithful and bringing good out of it.
Out of it, totally. Yeah, and this all, I mean, Paul had to have had this verse on the brain when he's writing Romans 8:28, right? God works all things together for good. And so there's this beautiful, beautiful promise to hold on to. God's goodness, God's faithfulness in the midst of the dumb choices we often make and just the chaos of a broken world. So I love it. It's a Joseph story.
That's awesome.
Cool.
I think we maybe just wrestle with that story, sort of pick up I don't know, whatever people as they're listening, like what resonated with them, but also resonating or stepping into in this detour, what is the transformative work God is wanting to do? How is the Spirit present to you? How is the hesed or steadfast love of God with you? And how is he, even in the midst of this, taking something that is not good, right? COVID-19 is not good, and bringing good out of it in us. Maybe we'll talk about that.
Yeah, it'd be good.
Sounds good.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.